Quick question. How many of you have played the game Jenga? Raise your hand. How many of you like to play Jenga? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you are good at playing Jenga? Raise your hand. Sorta? Okay. If you've ever played Jenga, how many of you get nervous once there's not a lot of pieces left? You know that one time where as you start taking turns and you pull those pieces, and we can go ahead and turn to the next slide. Okay, and you look at those Jenga pieces. For those of you who don't know Jenga, it's these little blocks. They make a little stack, and you're supposed to pull one at a time so that you see spaces in between. But by making spaces, you're going to have to balance that little stack. So every time you pull out a little piece of wood, a little stick, then that Jenga stack becomes a little bit harder in terms of the balance, because when you take it out, you put it right back on top. You don't just hold it. You're supposed to put it right back on top, and it makes it heavier. So you have to figure out your engineering mind to figure out where is the best. And I know there's every time you do one, sometimes somewhere in the turn, you pull out one piece of Jenga, and then all of a sudden you see the whole stack shift like this, like it's a slight earthquake, and then it never fails. And as soon as that first piece that comes out that actually makes that thing shake, all the group that plays that goes, whoa, right? And so, if you've ever played it, how many of you get actually nervous at those moments? Raise your hand besides me, right? Yeah, because one, we don't want to lose, and then two, we don't want to be the one to make all that racket when it crashes down on the table. Well, Jesus reminds us that our lives are kind of like a Jenga sometimes, and we don't want our faith in life to be that shaky. And that's what many ways this passage is about. But before we get there, Jesus starts with a riddle. And it's a lot of little riddles that was kind of spewed as Jonathan read it this morning. But I have a riddle for you, in fact. Think about this for a moment. You are all running a race, and you pass the person in second place. What place are you in now? Anyone, shout it out. Okay, so if you said first place, you're wrong. You're in second place. All right, see, that's what the riddle is. Sometimes people get riddles and sometimes people don't. And Jesus is telling riddles to his disciples. And when he says it, he says, when a blind man or a blind person leads another blind person, what happens? And he goes on to say, they both fall into the ditch. And then he goes on to say another riddle. Students cannot become better than the teacher when the class is finished. If anything, they're supposed to be just like the teacher. That is the Jesus model of discipleship, that you don't ever become better than Jesus. You're actually supposed to be like Jesus. Why look at the speck of dust in your sibling's eye when you haven't realized that you have a 2x4 in your own eye? I use 2x4 because I had a feeling June Yamaki would be here, and she's a contractor. Not to say, June, that you do this. And on top of that, how can you tell your sibling, Jesus says, dear sister, let me try and blow out the dust from your eyes when you yourself cannot even see, because there is that 2x4 blocking your vision, and because it is stuck in your own eye and you can't get it out yourself. Obviously, at least take out the 2x4 from your own eyes before you even attempt to try and blow the dust from your sibling's eyes. Otherwise, why? You cannot see clearly enough anyways. And then Jesus continues with his riddles. Good trees do not produce bad fruit. Bad trees do not produce good fruit. In other words, you won't get lemons when you're planting an apple tree, because if you do, you have something there that actually might, worth a lot of money. But that's another story, right? You won't be able to experience oranges when you're trying to grow a coconut tree. A good person, Jesus says, brings good treasures from their hearts. A good person brings good things from their hearts, while an evil person brings evil things. Jesus says, finally, with all these riddles, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? This is what it's like when someone comes to me, hears my words, puts them into practice. It's like a person building a house by digging deep and laying the foundation on bedrock. When the flood came, the rising water smashed against that house, but the water couldn't shake the house because it was well built. But those who don't put into practice what they hear are like a person who built a house without a foundation. The flood water smashed against it and it collapsed instantly. It was completely destroyed. Now, how many of you would rather have a strong foundation over a weak and sandy foundation? Raise your hand. Yeah, absolutely, right? But when we read this, many times we think about it just in terms of our own life. How many of us actually realize that when we read this and we hear this, that we're supposed to hear it and read it and even interpret it with other people in mind? You see, I've always heard and have been told by other wonderful preachers that whenever you see a Christian walking alone, it's usually a struggling Christian. Well, this morning, as Jesus brings jokes, I say Jesus brings jokes or riddles, but what he's really saying is that even though he gives these riddles, there is a little truth in all of these riddles. Riddles are supposed to teach us small little nuggets of lessons. And as he says this, we read in many ways that even though Jesus says, good trees do not produce bad fruit and bad trees do not produce good fruit, he's talking not about necessarily trees or planting them. He's really talking about a community who are called the Pharisees. And as the Pharisees, they continue to lead their people in their churches in Jesus' days to follow the laws of God, but not necessarily out of love, but simply as rules of do's and don'ts. But that's not what God intended when he gave these laws. You see, when it comes to laws, even Jesus took them very seriously. And when it comes to these laws out of the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, altogether, do you know how many laws the Hebrew and Jewish folks were supposed to follow? Anyone know that number by chance? Someone says 600 something. That's pretty good, David. Not bad. Can you all say 613? Right? I mean, how many of you have gone to school and how many times have you heard your teacher tell you specifically, Kite, stop running in the hallways, right? And then what I do is I look at her, and I run even faster, hoping that she doesn't catch me, right? I was a little rascal in school, I have to admit. I'm glad Terry wasn't necessarily my direct teacher when I was in school. But Jesus even took these rules seriously, but Jesus came at it with a whole different attitude, a whole different perspective. Jesus came wanting people to learn God's laws, not to separate, because that's what the laws were meant to be, supposedly, according to the way the Jewish folks led it or read it or even lived it out, is that when they follow these rules, they follow it because no one else will be able to go ahead and follow these rules like the Hebrew people, like God's people. So by doing so, they were supposed to separate themselves from those who don't know how to live under God's rules. Now, Jesus says there's rules, but the kind of attitude you bring to these rules is not that just because they don't know how to follow these rules that they're bad people. Jesus says, no, these rules are set so that we can go ahead and continue to find ways to know how to engage one another, know how to value one another, know how to love one another, know how to respect one another. Jesus recognizes that we are all in a place where we want life and we want it abundantly. But in order for us to have life and have it abundantly, we are called to make sure that the person next to you has life and has it abundantly first. Take a moment, and when you hear the word neighbor, who do you think of? Because neighbor is defined so differently in scriptures. And when we think of how to engage someone, whether we know them or if there's just someone that we just met, when we think about how to engage someone, we all engage them differently. Why? Because we're all kind of wired differently. How many of you are introverts? Raise your hand. Okay, all of you raise your hand, you're a bunch of liars, because normal introverts wouldn't raise your hand and be spotted. just, I just wanted to try that out. It worked. Thank you. Thanks, Denise. You got it. But it's true. Some of us are introverts and some of us are extroverts. Some of us love to be around crowds. For some reason, when we're around crowds, we wake up. Some of us, when we're around crowds, we're like, oh, let me find the nearest corner so I can just sit there quietly and just people watch, right? We're all wired differently. And just because someone knows how to say hi, whether hey, like me, or someone just says hi, like my wife, Caroline, that doesn't mean she's any less friendly. Caroline had no idea I was going to bring her into this sermon. I can only do this because it's Father's Day. It's Father's Day, Caroline. I love my wife. But at the end of the day, it's really, in many ways, Jesus gives these riddles to remind us that out of the 613 laws, no one really followed them. So what happened? So even with that said, Moses decided, you know what, don't worry about it. I'm going to give you 10 commandments. Can you follow 10? And believe it or not, we can even follow 10. And so Jesus came along and said, you know what? I get it. Remembering 10 things is harder than remembering your 7-digit phone number. So I'm just going to go ahead and summarize it in 2. Jesus says, love the Lord your God with what? All your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And you have your own definitions of what it means to love God with all of your what? Heart, mind, soul, and strength. And when we say strength, that's defined in so many different ways. We know what heart is. It's our heart. It's our feelings, our emotions. We know what our mind is. It's the way we think, what we allow to be influential, right? And we know what our soul is. That soul is that very being of who we are. But what does it mean to love God with all of our strength? And according to scriptures, there's different ways of explaining this, but simply it's with not your muscles, but it's actually with your resources. How do you love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and resources? Well, Jesus says, I'm going to tell you, because I have a second command just like it. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Now, depending on cultural situations, some of us, depending on personalities, some of us sit there going, I don't know if I really love myself the way I hear it. But in reality, we do care about how we feel. We do care about our mental health. We do care about our physical health. And in those ways, God is saying, as much as you care about yourself in that way, try and care about the person around you. Jesus reminds us that it doesn't make sense to call Jesus Lord, Lord, when we're not listening, we're not following, when we're not obedient to what Jesus calls us to be, when Jesus calls us to simply live out these simple commands. Jesus reminds us it doesn't make sense to call Jesus Lord, Lord, without loving the rest of God's children, the marginalized, the broken, and as Jesus would say it in Matthew 25, the least of these. We as Christians, we as human beings, we as people of God have to take steps. No matter how big or small the steps may be, we are called to take steps to be better about loving others and saving our environment. I noticed when I got to Centenary last year, we know how to engage one another and we do our best. But I'm not sure if we're still doing what we can in our own simple lives on how to care for our environment. Our environment continues to get worse and worse, and we have a say in it. When I got to Centenary last July, as you know, Jane and Judy and Cynthia and many folks and Gail and you know even Reverend Mark Nakagawa was showing me around the church. We would show around, and one of the things I noticed was that there were mugs with Centenary United Methodist on it. So I said, "What are these mugs for? There's so many. You know, how do you know which is which? You know, do we all end up having to share the same mugs? Are there names in the back of them or anything?" She says, "No. Says, these mugs are so that we don't use as many paper cups or styrofoam foam cups." And I went, wow, that's cool. Y'all are way ahead of the game here. But when I came in because of the pandemic, we didn't meet. But when we started meeting, I started realizing we're using styrofoams again. And I said, no, we got to try to figure out how to pray against that a little bit. Let's go back to the cups. And those are simple steps that could make a big impact, because what we do at church, I hope that we will be able to do in our own lives. And that's the point. We come to church to be the model, to experience the model so that we live it out in the world. I was told by one of our members, I come to church because I want to be filled and know how to take that feeling out into the world for that week, and I'll come back again. And I feel like many of us sort of feel that way. So I do hope that we hear God's words when he says, follow these two commands. Love each other, love the environment as much as you love yourselves. Because if you want to love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, that's how you do it. And if that doesn't resonate, then let me end with this. John Wesley summarizes the great commandments this way, according to my eyes. He says, do no harm. Just do good wherever you are. And keep loving God. Can you repeat with me? Do no harm. Do good. And keep loving God. If we can do those three things, I tell you, I think we can be living in a better place. Amen? Can you imagine in our elementary schools, in our preschools, in our middle schools, high schools, universities, right? In our job places, even in our families, our own families, spiritual and blood related, even in our own families. Can you imagine if not to look at the other person, because remember the 2x4 and the sawdust speck, right? Not to look at them and say, you need to do no harm. You need to do good. You need to keep loving God. Not that way. God is speaking to us and saying, take a mirror and say, look, Key, do no harm. Key, do good. Kite, keep loving God. God is speaking to each and every one of us, because in order for us to feel that wonderful foundation in life that God wants us to be a part of, God is saying, you have to do our best to make sure that we love on our neighbors, because when they do well and they're healthy and they're following God, well, guess what? It helps us already. We can't live on this earth just because we're the only ones healthy. We have to make sure others are healthy around us. God has called us to be a loving community, not just one person who was well. God is calling all of us to be well. So I say again, for you and each and every one of you, repeat after me again, but when you do, think of it as you're speaking to yourself. In your mind, when I say it, just say your name quietly to yourself. And I'd say, do no harm. Repeat. And this is you're speaking to yourself. Do good. And remind yourself again, keep loving God. Repeat that as much as you can. When you engage, when you're praying, when you're thinking, just keep telling yourself, Key, do no harm. Key, do your best to do good. And of course, keep loving God. Amen?